Stick around to see how these 5 modern CSS buttons were made. I went ahead and created the HTML and CSS files. I have the basic boilerplate and the CSS linked up here in the head. Now let's make the button we're gonna be styling. I'm making a div here, which will serve as a container. It will be centered, so we can better see our buttons. Also making the standard anchor element with a couple classes, button and button1. Now we can start having fun. Now I don't like the default font, so I'm just importing a new one from Google Fonts and setting this font to all elements. I'm removing the default underline from the anchor element. Now let's center the container using absolute positioning. And let's add some properties every button will have. Just adding some padding, increasing the font size, and adding the all-important transition here. Just remember to keep the transition short and snappy like the 0.2 seconds here. Now let's make that button interesting. To achieve this slick rounded look, we use the border radius property, setting it to something big like 50 pixels. Of course, for this to work we need to have borders, so let's just make a 1 pixel border with this nice magenta color. Also set the color of the text to that same color. Now, using the hover selector, we can style the button when the user hovers over it. Just setting the background color to that magenta, and then also the text color to white, and we're all done. For this one, we're gonna be using the before selector, which will allow us to have that rising rectangle effect. For this to work properly, we need to set our button positioning to relative and our before element positioning to absolute. Also, in the before, we always need to specify content, so let's write an empty string since we don't want any text. We want it to start at the bottom left with full width and no height. It needs to inherit the transition from the button. It also needs a negative z-index value like -1 to ensure it appears behind the button. Try and see what happens without this z-index. When we hover over the button, we want the text to be white. And while we are hovering, we also want the before element to assume the full height of the button. And that's it. For this one, we're gonna be using the before selector again to achieve the shine effect. For the button itself, we're using a black, almost completely transparent bottom border for that 3D looking shadow. Also setting the overflow to hidden so that the shine is contained only within the button. And for hover, we simply change the background to a slightly darker color. Again, the empty content and absolute position for the before element, but this time we want the shine to be thin, like 10% of the width here, and starting slightly to the left of the button. Setting the color of the shine to a very transparent white and skewing it by a few degrees, like -15 here. You can play around with these values until you get something that's just right for you. On hover, we want the shine to move all the way to the right and then some. So we set the left position value to something like 110%. We are also setting the transition here in the hover. This is so the shine doesn't animate coming back from the right side. There we have it. It's pretty subtle but effective. This one is by Kanish Kunal from superwebresources.com, link in the description. To achieve the 3D effect, we will use a very light border for highlights, a white color set to something like 0.3 transparency. And we will use a box shadow property for the 3-dimensional effect. Just set the Y of the shadow to something like 4 pixels while keeping the blur at 0, so we get that nice hard shadow. Box shadow color should be just slightly darker than the background color of the button. For the click effect, we will use the active selector. In it, we reduce the Y of the box shadow to something like 2 pixels and also move the button slightly down by 2 pixels using top property. This is made possible because we set the button's position to relative. And just like that, we're done. Finally, for the last button, we will use a gradient instead of a flat background color. We specify the direction, in this case 90 degrees, since we want it from left to right, first color at 0% and second color at 100%. We will set the background size on the x-axis to 200%, so we have some room to move the gradient later. Also specifying the background position for the x-axis to be at 0, all the way to the left. A soft box shadow with a big blur and a slow transition for that soft effect. For the hover, we want to move the background position on the x-axis further along to the right. For example, 70%, but you can put anything here that you think looks great. Setting the opacity in the box shadow color to something small just so that soft shadow appears. And that's it. There you have it. 5 easy to code modern CSS buttons created just like that. It's that easy. If you enjoyed the video, consider giving it a like and subscribe for more content like this. See you in the next one.